two towers, a huge explosion.
If we don't learn about what happened 20 years ago, most probably we want to repeat it.
I think there are a lot of reasons to remember 9/11. We should remember the fallen. We should remember when our otherwise successful efforts fail and learn from that.
For most Americans of my generation, and certainly for those of us involved in national security work, 9/11 was the worst day of our adult lives. It not only involved a huge and painful human cost, loss of many Americans' lives, it also exposed to us that we were in fact truly vulnerable in ways we could not imagine before that. And we've spent much of the last 20 years trying to address that vulnerability, looking to build both an offensive and a defensive capacity to make sure that a 9/11 attack never in fact happens again.
Were we alert at the time, and in particular the British and American governments? I think it's fair to say, the intelligence services, special forces community, we were always on alert in terms of what terrorists were planning and prosecuting. But that's been very difficult to translate that into a national security alert. Clearly the alert systems we're used to now are much more sophisticated, and they came in after 9/11. But I think the point here is as much, were we ready, or was this a failure of the imagination not to see these attacks coming? To me, there was certainly all the dots were out there in a very crowded landscape of intelligence signals. But the challenge, I think, which the Americans had was actually joining all those dots together, collaborating across department and across intelligence community, and really understanding that it was going to happen. It was a question of when rather than if.
I think we need to think about what's going to happen in the future. Unfortunately, I see us repeating our mistakes at great peril.
So the risk is that we become complacent. We think these things won't happen. Very interesting talking about this during a pandemic. A true once in 100-year event. 100 years ago, we were dealing with a pandemic, and we're dealing with one today. And in between, planners, thinkers, medics prepared for pandemic, but society didn't. It kind of forgot that these things could happen, even though so many people died 100 years ago.
I think we're living in very uncertain times, and there's a lot of drivers of terrorism which are part of the wider global security picture. Clearly, the pandemic is a driver, and that is going to have decades of impact of economic costs, which we've got to repay, which will undermine economic growth. It will reinforce the challenges of social inequalities, class divisions, the haves and the have-nots, not just in advanced markets, but in the wider parts of the world.
It surprises me. I'm a student of this, but I don't spend nearly enough time looking at it. But this is my observation. I don't think in the last 10 years I have read a national security assessment of any description for any country that didn't put pandemic right up there. Right. So pandemic's been at the top of our concern in terms of our assessment of what was likely to happen to our communities and to threaten them in the future.
One begs the question of whether is there an appropriate strategic risk management capability within government, which looks the same as businesses do. Businesses have their strategic risk registers.
The scale is also completely different. The 9/11 caused not quite 3,000 deaths. The pandemic has caused over 4 million deaths. 9/11 caused tens of billions of dollars in damages. COVID-19 pandemic has caused tens of trillions of dollars in damages. It's a bit of a different animal, but it really goes to show that no matter how smart humans in the insurance industry think we are, Mother Nature and the world always throws new challenges and risks at us.
And I think what needs to be remembered with COVID in particular is that the vast majority of the industry actually gave no pandemic coverage because it was viewed as being too dangerous and too systemic a loss to be able to cover. So those that were attempting to do so weren't ever pretending to do it in a blanket fashion, because nobody can pay for that sort of claim.
You'd hope on the back of the pandemic that we stood back and say, how do we, as a society, make sure that we have, I don't know, food supply chains, medical provision, an internet backbone that can really stand up to all of the various things that may happen to the United Kingdom?
I think instead it makes more sense to think about establishing a culture of resilience, making sure that we're in a position to manage the threat by making sensible choices around mitigating steps, to make sensible choices around response capabilities, to make sensible choices around how we prepare for terrorist attacks that might come to fruition. That's a different way of thinking about it. It doesn't require that we win. It simply requires that we develop a framework for managing a threat and not become single-mindedly focused on eliminating a threat that, to my mind, can't be eliminated in the near term.
Perhaps one of the most important ways that we've improved resiliency following 9/11 and the pandemic is greater threat awareness. In particular, after 9/11, greater government national security efforts and coordination. After the pandemic, understanding why it happens and how to prevent the next one.
It doesn't mean we will have perfect knowledge. It doesn't mean we will have perfect ability to predict or anticipate. But I think one of the lessons learned after 9/11 is that we have to think about the unthinkable, try to imagine what might today be unimaginable, and to begin to try to take steps to prepare for that. I think we're seeing that even in terms of the way in which the pandemic has played out on a global scale, to include the impact on each of our nations.
It's too complex a picture for it to be held by just by the government or by the private sector. And the private sector can bring a lot of capital, a lot of agility, a lot of innovation, and work alongside the government departments as well as academia to make sure that we are looking at the totality of the problem. Economic resilience is not just about taxpayers' money that has to be paid off. We want businesses to be able to invest in risk mitigation measures, but they need that advice, the right advice and the right education, and be able to make their own risk assessments and understanding what that threat is and what their vulnerabilities are.
And there are certain things that just the insurance industry isn't capable of insuring. The surplus that's generated in the insurance industry as a whole doesn't come close to paying for a large tail risk event. So there's always going to be an overspill in these situations.
So there's, I think, a built-in potential contradiction between the way private sector entities think and the way government thinks, and the only way to get around that is for the two to sit at the table and work through it together.
I think what we learned out of 9/11 is in order for us to be resilient, in order for us to be able to predict with any degree of certainty, that a public-private partnership is the key to that. And the appropriate sharing of data from the private sector to the government and the government to the private sector is absolutely essential.
You've asked me whether the United Kingdom has the right tools to manage major crises. And my view is that when you're dealing with a real crisis, there is no such thing as crisis management. There's crisis leadership, there's organisation in the face of the crisis. But almost by definition, if it's manageable, it's not a crisis. We're discussing this in the middle of a pandemic, the middle, not the end.
We've got major population increase in many parts of the world over the next 50 years, and that's associated with an increase in unrest, political violence, and terrorism. So we're expecting many parts of the world are going to experience a lot of problems. We have climate change impacts, which are also going to have an impact in terms of conflict, and terrorism. Already seems to have played a significant role in a number of conflicts in the last 20 years. And that problem is going to get worse over the coming century.
I do think we're in a more dangerous world now than we were in 2001, and not necessarily the same kind of world. So we have seen 20 years of chaos and destabilization.
And if there's a concern I have about the younger generation of underwriters, is that there's an over-reliance on modelling.
A lot of people working in the insurance industry today weren't really fully sensitive to what happened on 9/11.
And it's too easy to say, well, this was the answer, this is the price, and this and just write a poor risk because of it.
The reinsurers ultimately fully honored their commitment, but then the reinsurers started to withdraw from the market and put terrorism exclusions in their policies. It wasn't impossible to get terrorism insurance at that time, but it went from being something that was generally free and had not been modeled to something where suddenly insurers wanted some extra premiums for it, and there was insufficient capacity in the very high-profile markets such as downtown Manhattan. That started to impact jobs. The insurance industry and the marketplace, a number of the developers, real estate groups, unions very quickly went to Congress and demanded a solution. Because of the not only 9/11, but the anthrax attacks at the time, the congressional buildings were shut down. And so I had to borrow my wife's laptop, and my colleague Charles Symington borrowed his wife's cell phone. And working on our wife's equipment, we developed the initial TRIA program, Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, in just about 3 weeks.
Models will always have limitations, given the fact that they rely on historical data. They are not a good tool to use in isolation. They have to be used with judgment and with one's own experience. So in terms of unprecedented events, it's very difficult for them to be accurate. With CBRN, arguably, we haven't had a major loss event, and yet there are models out there forecasting what could happen.
Well, I think there's been a number of changes structurally. The creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is one good example. To have a senior leadership overarching the community to provide guidance, encouragement, policy, set the standards and the expectations for cooperation, collaboration, and appropriate information sharing. And I can only speak for my own agency. We, in fact, undertook a wholesale cultural change. And we also brought together a powerful package. We enhanced the size of the Counterterrorism Center and encourage sharing, encourage collaboration, and encourage cooperation. And it was not just within the agency and within the Counterterrorism Center, but it was also across agency boundaries with the FBI, with NSA, with the National Geospatial Agency, and others, with the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Insurers have a huge responsibility. It's not all financial. You know, people's lives are destroyed when things like this happen. And insurance is that tool to help the average citizen rebuild their life, right? I think that it's important that insurers keep that in mind for the future, that they have that responsibility. It's not just all bricks and mortar, right? And yeah, if I had to leave our discussion today with something, it's that. There's a human element to everything that we do. And it's very important that we keep that context.
The question of what keeps me awake at night, I think it's a departure of the physicality of terrorism. It's more the state-sponsored organized crime attacks of a cyber nature, you know, on our economies and on our private sector and our government as well. I think we have woefully underestimated, in 9/11 fashion, we've woefully been unable to predict the metastasization, the evolution, and the growth in capabilities and the willingness of nation states to use organized crime capabilities as tools in cyber warfare, nation on nation. That's what keeps me up at night.
Should the current situation in Europe have been foreseen? My honest take on that is that people did foresee serious struggle.
It actually was foreseen. It was predicted by Western intelligence services.
There were analysts who absolutely were right and were warning that Russia was capable of making this decision.
In many ways, it was extraordinary to see those intelligence services declassifying so much intelligence to put it out into the public domain in an attempt to name and shame Russia even before the invasion of Ukraine took place.
What does this mean in terms of mitigation against emerging threats? And I think there are a couple of lessons that we can take away straight away. Number one is a decision which to us looks obviously bad, filled with negative consequences, may look very, very different to somebody else, and wouldn't see the costs and the consequences in the same way that others did. We need to factor that into our decision making. In terms of mitigation, it's having an awareness that these types of events can also come into play, as well as stuff that we know is happening and we know is taking place, such as, for example, the impacts on climate change.
You know, Russia already displayed a brazen behavior in attacking dissidents in Germany, in the UK, killing them, poisoning them. They supported the Assad regime in using chemical weapons. It seems that they are repeating the same playbook in Ukraine, the same Syrian playbook they have. Some cities in Ukraine look like Aleppo after the regime and Russian attacks. So, I don't think it is shocking if Russia uses chemical weapons when they feel that their military on the ground are not able to deliver the victory that Putin thought he might have.
The implications for the insurance industry and policy leaders are simple and straightforward. We cannot any longer assume that conflict between nation states is a thing of the past, and certainly not on the European continent. It now must account for the idea that conflict between states is a reality, and that we are not simply in a world where terrorism and asymmetric conflict are part of the equation, but that actual conventional war carried out between two nation states is a part of the landscape.